So welcome everyone and thanks for joining us today. We've got a great event for you this afternoon. So before I hand over to Chris and Tony Ann, I'll just do a short introduction and share some housekeeping with you. So a bit about our partnership with MZN. Bond and MZN have been partners for many years. And over the years, we've run a lot of webinars together, focusing primarily on funding, strategies and organisational effectiveness. So MZN International are a social consultancy firm whose priority is to help those who want to do good better. They partner with leading nonprofit and public organisations to deliver greater impact in the developing world by securing more funding, developing smarter strategies, and building efficient, agile organisations. This current funding webinar series that MZN have developed provides a supportive space where we can delve deeper into the challenges we're all experiencing around funding. We're really grateful that MZN continue to support our members by lending their expertise, insight and experience through this webinar series. We will have another event in the series coming up soon in November. It's not live on our website yet, but will be shortly. So keep an eye out for that and we'll send you all comms on that in the future. So before I hand over, just a few pieces of housekeeping. So today's webinar is being recorded. So we'll share a recording of the presentation and the slides with you on our website and in our post-event email. Captions are available and you can turn them on if you need them. We will have lots of time for Q&A today, so please do think about your questions as you're listening. You can use the chat box to capture questions as they emerge and we'll address them at the end. If you do want to raise your hand, you can also do that and we'll unmute you, but please do introduce yourself by name and organisation. And finally, there will be a feedback form posted in the chat towards the end of the discussion, so please do let us know what you think of today's event. So with that, I'll hand over to you now, Chris and Tony Ann. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lewis. Really appreciate it, and a wonderful good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you are. I am signing in today from Hamburg, Germany, and autumn has finally reached us. We are here today to talk about a more conceptual, more difficult trend that has been in the works for close to a decade right now. Our sister company, Human Planet, which takes care of impact investment, has been working on this one for a while. We're bringing it more and more into the NGO space because there are more and more NGOs who benefit and who work on that. And I'm sure some of the terms we're discussing today, you've heard about before. But fundamentally, this is about how we fund our ambitions, our hopes, and the values, and the ambitious SDGs, where we are not doing so well funding-wise. Introductions first. I hope that all of you have gotten the Star Trek reference. As a former or sort of childhood Trekkie, I couldn't resist. All the pictures are AI. We had lots of fun with those. I'm joined here by my colleague, Tony Ann. Tony, do you just want to say hello? I think you're covering the next bit anyway, aren't you?
Yes. So hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tony Ann Robinson Beck. I'm a Jamaican living in Stuttgart, Germany, and I'm very excited to speak with you today. I'll be doing the subsequent slides up to slide 8, I believe, today.
I think so.
Yeah.
Let's dive right in.
Yes, of course. So, over the past couple of years, we have seen that there has been a shift in how donors are disbursing funds. They are focusing more on conditional and catalytic support, for example. Conditional would mean that the funding is ascribed to either predetermined outcomes, predetermined criteria, or any other factors that they believe would be conditional for success within an intervention. Whereas catalytic would be directly connected to whether spurring social or financial change by unlocking or leveraging additional resources. And they usually use that as an initial boost for larger investments. We have also seen that there has been a shift in private investments and other non-traditional sources of funding, not necessarily from donors. And we have also seen that governments, donors, private funders are collaborating a bit more in how they seek to provide support for some of the key challenges that we see the world is facing currently. So this could include public-private partnerships, multi-stakeholder platforms, blended finance initiatives, as well as triangular cooperation. Next slide, please, Chris.
Are you okay with your cough? I know you're a little bit sick still.
Yes. Right. So the next slide is where we have a breakdown of development finance trends. In this slide, it's up to 2002. So this up to 2011, sorry. So this would include domestic public resources, private resources domestically, international, public, and private. But as you can see from this slide, that the international private resources does not have a cutoff period. So we see that it's growing and increasing based on the trend shown in this slide, on the graph, sorry. And this would incorporate the more non-traditional donor mechanisms that we mentioned before. So this would include impact investments, blended finance, that sort of thing. And we see that it's taking place even right now. So this slide went up to 2011, but we see the trend happening now in 2024.
Yeah.
Next slide, please.
Just by the way, just to add to this one, I spoke to someone at Bloomberg yesterday who thought that this was an underestimation of the international private resources. So yeah, in response to the international public resources from which the most NGO funding is still derived from, there's not much dynamic happening here in the last, 10, 12, 13 years.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, Bloomberg thought this was probably an underestimate. I think this is just for reference, right?
Yeah. This is just a summary of what the lines would represent.
Yes, cool.
So we move to 6. Right. So for this slide, we see more in depth the gap between the SDGs and the funding that they would need to achieve them, basically. So over the past couple of years, we've realized that there are glaring gaps in what would be needed to achieve the SDGs. Currently, I believe it's at about 4 trillion, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's been exacerbated by quite a few challenges that we've been having recently, including the COVID-19 pandemic. Climate change is one of the top factors, as well as the sporadic and ongoing conflicts that have been taking place. Another challenge is that financing is not always directed to the countries and sectors that need it most. And vulnerable communities and populations are feeling the brunt of this neglect. So in this slide, you would see a focus on reproductive health, or HIV, as well as malaria. And for these two, there is a gap of 43 billion and 40 billion, respectively. So then you could see that just for focusing on these two and the large gap that they would have, how this would translate overall. Next slide, please.
So is that the gap that innovative finance is looking to cover then in reproductive health then, the 33.3?
Right. Okay, so as can be expected, there's quite a bit of an overwhelming sensation that NGO partners are feeling. It's as if it's so difficult to keep up with an ever-changing and ever-evolving sector, and at the same time try to carry out the interventions that you are carrying out in a very innovative and impactful way. So in the next slides, Chris will take you through how you can tackle this change.
Thanks, Tony, and I hope the cough is getting better, and thanks for doing this despite just having been off sick and being back today. Yes, as Tony had mentioned, we have this glaring gap of needs versus the funding we have. Obviously, a lot of our NGO partners are predominantly funding themselves through that ODA and with a grant-based model, that is the where there's not much happening in terms of growth and where there is a massive gap between the need. And I can't count the amount of meetings I'm in every day where it's mentioned that the need outpaces the resources they have. So innovative finance is a way to bridge this. This is not massively new. This has been a trend, has been going on for 15, 20 years. There are sectors which do this more advanced than other areas of thing, but now it's becoming particularly relevant for those organizations who either in the humanitarian or the development space want to fill that gap and be serious about it. So we've been working with our MZN partners that have signed up over the last sort of 10 years or so. A subset of those are very, very upfront and very aggressive and very active about changing that and saying, fine, if we want to use innovative finance mechanisms in order to make that gap between the need and what grants can provide as small as possible. So we thought for the first time, really, this is a way on want to share what we've been doing and provide a bit of an insight into innovative finance mechanisms around. So here's a thing where the changing role of finance is concerned. What you see here on the left, the blue part, if you imagine the spectrum of finance, where on the very, I'm not sure, sorry, can you actually see my cursor when I'm showing this, or is this not showing when I'm pointing at something?
It's showing for me.
Oh, good. Okay, that works. What we see on the left here in the blue is saying there's no cost recovery here. This is the traditional grants. Then we have at some point a cost recovery where we have a break even. So imagine that someone is putting in money into something that is good for either the planet, its people, or both, ideally, and they're getting it back. And on the right-hand side, we get a financial return, in other words, a profit, which is the right-hand side is this traditional investment that you would associate with investors running around buying companies, investing into tech and all this sort of stuff. That there was a sort of divide between these two worlds where governments and donors are financing public with no cost recovery. They just need a lot of reports. This is all public money. This is being spent. And then on the right-hand side is the market. And as we summarize in the meeting here, the organizations that is simply obsolete. There is a far greater awareness now of the ground from the middle, so from the middle of the blue and the, rouge or red here, that we would call a market-based solution or a innovative finance solution. Now, market-based solutions aren't new to NGOs, so this is not revolutionary in that sense. It just takes a little bit of adjusting to. And we've seen over the last the last decade or so, that organizations that simply have a plan to work with different types of funding already in a much stronger position to make a bigger impact because they just get more funding. And that breaks down into another smaller subset, which I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about. So you have the same, hopefully the colors are helpful, the same sort of no cost recovery extreme to absolutely making a killing to the right here. And if we look at this deeper, then you notice that this is, of course, a spectrum and not a absolute. So you have the traditional development assistance, the traditional money that we're all familiar with, the grants from the very institutional donors and large foundations. The fundraising would go in here as well, probably from private sources, things like that. You have that here on the very left and in the very blue, where someone donates money and then there's no return and you deliver a program. And if you've done everything right, then everybody is happy. Many of you may be familiar with conditional funding. Tony, and you've mentioned it earlier, where we have a pay for success model. So that could be a pay by results, often also called something like impact bonds or milestone-based payment debt swaps. And I don't want to get too geeky here as an accountant, but if anybody has any questions about these things later, then we can highlight them. And conditional funding, again, not massively new. This has been around. Results-based finance has been results-based funding has been around for many years, and that's what you would see here, that is moving slightly more towards commercial investment. What is maybe less well known with many organizations is this catalytic funding category, that again is a spectrum in and of itself. But here we talk about seed funding, development innovations. You heard donors funding into that one, grant challenges. These are funding modules where institutional donors provide money upfront for an unknown result. So they're trying to say, we're kicking off a innovation and hoping that draws in more public funds. So catalytic funding, as Tony Ann mentioned already, is this idea that the public donor, the public funder, takes the first loss of an innovation, invent something new, and then as soon as this becomes closer to market readiness or investability or insurability, other funders, impact investors, venture philanthropists draw in. Guarantees or public-private mechanisms are also a part of this. And this is where we have seen a lot of change within our partners over the last 10 years, where, for example, many of them, I've got a few concrete examples here later, say, look, we don't actually need this as a grant. We can actually use it as a catalytic funding, where we get a small grant from a donor to build a concept farm, for example, or a concept energy park, or a concept investment into SMEs, that are women-owned businesses, for example. And once these are showing some promise, once we've nurtured them to show some promise, we can draw in private finance using the NGO as a way to possibly even guarantee the funding or to use as a transaction design. Make it simple. And so this is where we've seen a lot of change happening. Then all of you may have heard on the right-hand side the term impact investment. This is obviously where this is, by the way, not mutually exclusive, but impact investment is, strictly speaking, the term where an investor, be that a individual, a company, a foundation, they do impact investments. Even USAID is considering doing so right now. Where they are saying, look, we do want a return, so there needs to be a profit, there needs to be a revenue model in whatever it is we're investing in, but we're quite happy to reduce the return, the profit, or we're investing for much longer than a traditional commercial investor would have thought, because we are more motivated by the impact mission. So typical, I had a case just about a month ago, or 2 months ago, middle of the summer, where someone invested into an agri business, made it a condition of the investment that at least a certain percentage of the employees are female, that they are working with, that they're paying certain wages, that they are treating them in a certain way, and that they're producing the agricultural products in a certain way. But in response to providing the financing, the impact investor says you can keep the money for 7 to 10 years, whereas a normal investor would probably look for an exit within 3, 4, 5, 6 years latest. So here we have the impact investment. And again, this is a spectrum. There are people who you would consider that, there are people who consider themselves more venture philanthropists. So they're moving closer to the cost recovery, or even saying we're happy to not even break even slightly, but we don't want to make it a grant. Sometimes merely for the fact that the grant is administratively so difficult. Then we have the socially responsible investing. Here we get into the market area. This is obviously has been subject to a lot of controversy. Here we're talking about environmental social governance investing, about thematic investment. Some put carbon funds and carbon credits into this area here. So we are trying to make a commercial investment more socially responsible. I would be, the first would say, like, wow, this is a very new market, but it really has its flaws at times. But I think that is because between the impact investors or the venture philanthropists here and those who normally invest and try to make their investment more socially responsible, there's a big different type of person. I think the different type here is that the impact investor is fundamentally more motivated by the impact than the return, whereas this might be slightly different with the social responsible investing. Then again, of course, some ESG funds have increased massively since COVID. In fact, it's probably one of the larger grants. And then here on the right-hand side, you have normal, traditional investment where we provide equity to a company in loans at market rates, where people invest in order to be involved, in order to make a return. And again, that is a spectrum. Some people are slightly motivated by this, and some people say, no, this is a straightforward stock for me. I don't want any operative side. To anticipate one question, the impact investors, my colleagues at Human Planet and myself work with a lot. They are also different from the socially responsible investors and the commercial investors by being extremely involved in what they invest in. They usually have some sort of personal connection to the cause, and that is makes them very much involved, which is great network-wise. Doesn't necessarily make it easier, but then again, you're grant implementers. Many of you know how involved and destructive a donor can be as well. So hopefully that helps you a little bit. There's a slide we can go, which I'm hiding here, which we can go back to in case there are questions. Just looking at the time. Yeah, we're doing all right. So I want to give you some practical examples and have some more fun with the Star Trek-based theme here. I hope there are many Trekkies here. Few practical examples of the last sort of 6-7 months. An Amsterdam partner in Eastern Africa, they've built a 15 million small and medium-sized enterprise investment fund from impact investors who by themselves would be too small to invest here, and they invest into women-led SMEs there. Some of these SMEs are small chains of bakeries. There's a delivery business out there. There's an SME in a refugee camp providing finance into cycle repairs to provide a livelihood. And they absolutely need and want the NGOs to with their grassroots knowledge and localized exposure to be there. So some of the investments provided a advisory component back, that fee that goes back to the NGOs and earn money. And some say, look, I only want to seed invest, and then hopefully someone else will be drawn into. We did have in one country, I'm a little bit tight of confidentiality here, where investment was more difficult. We had a donor guarantee a loss that might have been occurring if the government is playing nasty. We did get that loss insurance, and that really opened the floodgates. And I'm pleased to say that the investment fund was oversubscribed. They needed 15 million. They could have had 20 or so, but it was oversubscribed when this was finally launched after a lot of work. Another idea is a humanitarian partner in the Middle East we're currently working with advised on an infrastructure project that investors are investing on. Obviously, this is a current the area that they invested on is conflict affected, and the investor was very sensitive to this and wanted the NGO in there to advise on and manage the humanitarian aspects of this infrastructure being built. So from the side of the investor, this was just a risk reduction measure for which they pay. The risk reward was too high. And for the NGO involved, they said we really would like to make sure that what we're building here is fair and is accessible to the entire community, and can be used for future humanitarian response. So so they were involved, and they earned a good income with that. So it was a transactional at hand. That is part of an impact investment as well. A third concrete example would be another organization we are working with since 2 years in Eastern Europe. And they've mobilized not an investment, but to secure a guarantee for loans that we build homes and farms in particular. So again, in the agricultural sector. The story behind it is simply that commercial investors were happy to provide the loans to those who need to be building their farms and their homes, but their default risk was too high. There's many people there without a credit history, and they were excluded basically from the credit market. So the NGO mobilized a guarantee from a international financial institutions, and a traditional donor. So some of the names you already know, and say, look, we guarantee 30% of the loans. So the first 30% of defaults, we will simply pay back to the investors. Again, that lowered the risk for the investors to a degree that they could invest. And now they make these loans available to people who so urgently need them. And lastly, but also an example from earlier this year in Western Africa, where a organization that is traditionally working in the livelihood space, a lot through cash transfers, has helping very innovative business owners in the health and plastic recycling find the funding from investors. And for that, again, they're taking they are offering the investors not country knowledge, grassroots knowledge that the investor needs in order to invest here in Western Africa, which is not always the easiest place to attract foreign direct investment. So again, the NGO is achieving its livelihood task, the mission, but through a very different way. Hopefully these examples trigger some, make it more tangible, and or may even trigger an idea with you for your organization. So that's all very interesting, all very nice. What do you do with us? Well, it's like anything. If that is completely, all of this is known to you, congratulations, fantastic. You can leave. We're done here. If it's not, then first number task is obviously dive deeper into what I barely scratched the surface on here with my colleague Tony Ann. So that we are currently designing a new online coaching and a new one day in-person training on this one. It will come out probably next month. You can already find lots of resources around innovative finance and impact investment on the MZN website if you are desperately for solutions right now. You can also ask yourself in either a half-day workshop or just along the water cooler and the coffee machine, can our mission be financed differently? Are you working in an area that could be done differently? Does it always need to be grants? Because as Tony has shown, the grant funding isn't materially increasing. In fact, it's probably decreasing. If the answer to this one is principally yes, maybe, then we always recommend developing 1 or 2 flagship programs for innovative finance. So rather than doing it specific for one case, saying, hey, this is a type of program that has, for example, a risk reduction profile, or it has a revenue model involved in it, here we can develop programs in various countries and write a pitch for this one, and then sell the pitch or market the pitch for several countries for several times. That's just more efficient than doing it on a case-by-case basis. And finally, yes, you do need to hire, or at least get in or acquire specialist business development expertise. This is very different from the grant-based funding model. So we know that, for example, Save the Children Ventures or IRC, for example, or Mercy Corps, in fact, some of them are very clear about positioning themselves in the innovative finance space. We have impact investment funds that are being set up and owned by NGOs quite a lot right now. If you don't want to go to that length, there may be something else you can do by hiring specialist expertise here. I think I'm closing with a few lessons that we've learned working on this one for a while right now, for close to 10 years. So in a nutshell, we have a changing funding landscape again, and that requires really new skills. We have a lot of our NGOs, Tony, and you've mentioned it, they're feeling overwhelmed. We have a lot of our NGOs who suddenly find themselves talking to a very new type of people. Instead of donors, they suddenly have to also work with investors and banks and insurances. And not only are they different people, they also speak a very different terminology, and the pace of working is very different. The investors, they spend maybe 10, 15 days making an investment decision and no more. Insurances take a lot longer, and some of your partner organizations on your grassroots level may not be used to this. So there's a big change happening there. The terminology, that can be outright confusing. I think that half the time that finance professionals they're spending it inventing their own language. Sometimes it's unnecessarily complicated. I guess it's like in any sector, but the two sectors are now increasingly coming together, and we need to find a common language. And frankly, most NGOs struggle conceptually or operationally with channeling non-grant funding. Many NGOs are built to attract and implement grant funding at scale and very professionally, but they're not necessarily built to receive and host and deploy investors' capital. So there's an operational challenge here. There's also a leadership challenge here. Some people do not appreciate the difference between commercial investments or venture philanthropy and impact investments, and categorically say, well, all investments, all market-based solutions in that sense are too risky for us. We're not doing it. The other one is we've learned, and I think, Tony, and you've been at the receiving end of that recently, is that an investment pitch really is not a grant proposal. They're much shorter, they're much sharper, the transaction design needs to be extremely clear. Whereas a grant is much longer and more, what can I say, academic, more descriptive, something along those lines. The good news for localization is, and that's my our personal opinion, and that because investors are inherently more aware that their investment needs to work locally, they tend to be operating from the grassroots up. In fact, they want the NGOs in there because of your grassroots knowledge. So that's good news for localization and utilizing that network. I think they're inherently more local than donor grants from London, Washington, Berlin, and Brussels. So that's the good news. And I think that's it. My colleague Nicole, she's currently on holidays, but she would ask me to share with you that we have a few new online training courses that are launching. I think there's a cohort starting on proposal writing in about 2 weeks' time. And now it's time for questions. Okay. Did I press anything that is wrong? Meg and Gemma, I cannot see the Q&A.
Hi, Chris. Yes,
Hey.
just having a look. So yeah, anyone's got any questions, please do pop them in the chat box, the Q&A box, or raise your hand if you'd like to ask Chris a question. Got lots of experience here, so anything you want to ask. I've got someone with a hands up there. Hi, Kate. I'm just unmuting you now.
Thanks. Hi, Christian and Tony-Ann. Thank you so much for that. And Tony-Ann, I'm sorry you're feeling sick. Thank you for coming anyway. Yeah, Chris, thank you for saying that a lot of us are feeling overwhelmed. I think that's very, very accurate. So thank you for acknowledging it. Personally, my funding team is in a position where we're an organisation that has been grant funded for, I don't know, millennia, and is finding it incredibly difficult to get their heads around the idea that there might be another way. They're incredibly risk averse, and anything that even smells remotely commercial just feels wrong to people. So we're spending a lot of time and energy trying not to say, get over it, get used to it, this is happening, we need to jump in. Are there any kind of, I don't know, are there any magic words, any examples or anything that you can help us with to convince people that it's past time to kind of start taking the first steps?
Well, Kate, by the way, would you be happy to share which organization you're referring to?
Oh gosh, what the heck? That's fine. I'm only maternity cover. It's Humanity and Inclusion. So we're a French development and humanitarian organisation.
Okay. Look, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the inherent difficulty, Kate. This is difficult. There are very few people who've been in finance and in development or humanitarian action at both parts of their career, because usually humanitarians are not motivated by money, and usually investors are a little bit more motivated by money. So these are two different types of people that are clashing here right now. So I like to acknowledge that. I also like to acknowledge that there are areas where innovative finance plays a very small or no role. Interestingly, not in humanitarian response. That's a big role there. But there are areas where we have to be realistic. This will always be grant funded. There's nothing to be done here, you know. So let's acknowledge those first of all and say, let's not reinvent the wheel where we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The other one, Kate, I guess I'm in a ton of conversations these days where everybody expresses what you just expressed. There's fear, there's skepticism. There is very timid progress from the NGO side. And then when you put them in a room with an investor who says, we'd like to deploy this within the next 2 to 4 weeks, then the timelines, as I mentioned, people just sort of, whoa, hang on a second, you know, hang on. So there's different type of people there. But it comes down to this. I mean, if your mission is fundamentally not achievable with grant funding, then what's the alternative? So, you know, are we just giving up? Are we continuing to admire the problem, or are we reinventing ourselves? We are not going to get there with technological innovation and or grant funding. There's, you know, the other one is our own self-interest as NGOs. Let's acknowledge that. It seems to me that many NGOs are fighting harder and harder for a smaller and smaller part of the pie. And going slightly better at the old traditional funding is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But I think the other part is the last sort of thing is it's not like you need to jump into the cold water straight away. So there's a way of saying, look, let's do this workshop and look into our program, spend half a day as a team answering the question, could we even finance what we want to do, our ambition differently? If so, in which country? That doesn't take super long. That takes a morning until about 2 o'clock. If you have lunch in the middle. Seriously, and then you say, you know, let's just have a couple of investors dial in and provide some more sort of stories about how they enacted this and how they did this or what they are interested in. I've led a workshop or facilitated a workshop, the one I mentioned, about 2 months ago. And frankly, what I said was met with skepticism. And then we said, well, fortunately, we have a couple of impact investors dialing into the meeting for 20 minutes. And it suddenly became real. It suddenly went, oh, okay.
Yes, yeah.
All right, he seems nice. Okay.
Oh, also a human, yeah.
Yeah. It's a bit like this. It's a bit like, oh, so he's not a Warren Buffett trying to take over the world. I'm not sure that Warren Buffett is trying to take over the world, by the way. Sorry, before I get sued. Sorry. You know what I mean? He's not some duck who's just out in it for the money. Now I get super Disney. Never mind. So that humanizing that really helps, and then going by it very very targeted, saying, you know, all right, in financial inclusion, for example, is, you know, how are you going to manage that without onboarding your I hate the word beneficiaries, but you know what I mean, your users into the banking system. Unless you want to open your own bank, bit difficult, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that really helps. And also, very interestingly enough, it's us in the global north who are skeptical. When we talk to our partners in the global south, there's markedly less skepticism. They're literally like, yeah, sure, you know, we do business all the time, you know, and that's my personal impression. They are way ahead of us there.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I'm also wondering if there's something about these models that exclude smaller and local organizations because they can't afford the lawyers and the accountants and all of that kind of setup stuff. But actually, maybe what you're saying is that we need to get out of the way of our partners and let them.
First of all, the lawyers, the accountants, etc., they are part of the transaction costs. So they're usually paid by the investor. So just to specifically lay that out. Obviously, we need to streamline that. And my experience in the last 2-3 years is that impact investment or venture philanthropy down to large local partners worked faster and smoother than to international NGOs.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
So I thought which is good news, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's super, super helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I know it's not always easy to be the first one with your hand up, so really appreciate you chipping in there and asking the first question. We've got another hand up, but we've also got about 15 questions in the Q&A box. Maybe we'll just take a few of those first, and then
You say 50?
15, yes.
Oh, thank God.
And 50, yeah, no, we'd be here all day. I'm sure we could be. So I'll just go through some of the questions on the in the Q&A chat box, and then Emma will come to you shortly with your hand raised. So yeah, a few questions here. There's one that's sort of there's two questions here that are kind of two sides of the coin. So we've got Kate asking, you mentioned securing innovative finance is hard for West Africa. We're in Central Africa. What tips would you have for starting to find suitable funders in unattractive investment areas? And on the other side, we have another question where someone's asked, are some cause areas easier to secure innovative finance than others? And do you have examples of organizations working in global health who are successfully doing this?
Okay, that's a lot. So in terms of areas, it depends. To make things a little bit easier, I would advise to think around what your the economy and the livelihoods in which the people you work for in these countries, be that in West Africa, Southeast Asia, or in the Arctic, if you like, work. If the majority of people in those areas work on a particular industry, then that's probably investable in some way, shape, or form. What you can do as an NGO, saying, look, maybe we want the fisheries to gain access to the global market, or we want the mining business to be less exploitive and more naturally sustainable. Maybe we would like the food supplies to be not just exported but locally used, and maybe we etc. So on these areas, I would start thinking about the value chain and the supply chain in the areas where you work. And in many areas in the world, we have prime industries, which are maybe not as healthy and not as happy and not as sustainable and certainly exploitive, more exploitive than we would want them to be. Now, what's amazing, also really positive, is that I meet a lot of investors and investment organizations who say, look, I would like to invest into, say, let's talk about a very dirty business, mining in West Africa, but I'm not going to do so because I know they have a lot of child labor. So if we can, even at the cost of increasing the transaction cost and increasing the time I lend my money to them, if we can build this business which is there in a sustainable, human rights respecting and dignified way, then we are interested. Otherwise, we can't and we won't invest, or we're even pulling investment out. You can work with the local organizations there, saying maybe you're not investable because of how you operate at the moment. So maybe we can work together. I think is that an answer? Sorry, does that helpful? Instead of saying this industry and this industry and this industry, I would say have a look on what businesses there are in the areas you work. And on the medical side, medical is extremely investable. In fact, there's lots of people who still don't have appropriate medical support, particularly reproductive medical support or psychosocial care, for example. And I think we've got to stop thinking about the areas in the territories in which we work as all of these people being poor and not being able to afford anything. There's usually a layer and a middle class who can say, look, I'm happy to pay something, but not everything. And then you have an investable thing. Here we would probably go more towards capitalistic finance, not something that looks for a return, but more for a donor who says, I will take the first loss for an investor then to build that additional hospital or to build the MRT unit. We had a case from Easter this year, it was April this year, where a international financial institution simply provided a guarantee to a hospital in Southeast Asia, or to a series of hospitals, in fact, and that allowed the hospitals to take loan finance into getting MRT machines, which are, revolutionized healthcare in these areas. There was no MRT in these areas. So I hope that Lewis, help me out. Was that a response? Does that help? I'm providing more examples.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. And that's plenty of detail there. So if you have any follow-up questions, you can continue to put them in the chat box. We've got plenty more to ask Chris and Tony Ann. So one here, well, there's two here on commercial contracts again, so I'll just sort of wrap them up together. So we have a question about how do NGOs cater the surplus profit made in commercial contracts? As NGOs' objective is not for profit, what are the sort of tax impacts on NGOs when they go for commercial investments and make returns out of them? We also have another question that's kind of a more sort of fundamental definition. What are the basic differences between commercial tenders and grants, and how do we identify?
Okay, so the first one, again, it depends where you are. There, for example, if you're operated as a GmbH, which is a sort of non-profit here in Germany, you are allowed to make a profit, just not over a period of several years. But in the 1 year, you can use a profit, and then you can use that profit up again in the following years. In other jurisdictions, the NGO is not allowed to make a profit for any 1 year. But they can start reserves, for example. So if you're putting that into the reserve for a future spend, then accounting-wise, yes, you have some money, you just haven't spent it yet, but at the bottom is a zero still. In still other countries, we have generated a fair amount of surplus so that this reserve policy didn't really play out anymore. And because the concept worked with our partners there, they've actually started a for-profit business, which feeds its profits annually back to the NGO. So you can park your money there, basically. In still other ways, they've used the profit and set up their own investment fund, saying instead of mobilizing funding from other investors, let's grow that. So that case that I asked earlier about raising the 15 million, that was a great example, because they said, okay, we've raised that, we have this amount of surplus right now. You know what, the next time we want to ask for more because we're oversubscribed, but we're also going to put our own money in, because that's obviously a great pull factor. If you can say we are investing our 2 million and then we are asking for another 20 million from the market, you have some skin in the game that draws in more funding, basically, and they can now do that. So there's a way around this. Again, what Kate said, we have to think a little bit outside the box.
Thank you. So good question here. We've got someone who's a one-woman business development team.
Wow.
So needless to say, they don't have the resources to hire a financing consultant or more business development staff. So how do they convince leadership that this is a long-term investment and that they need support? Not that they can't learn, but they don't have the time to necessarily manage the current portfolio and seek new investment partners. So how do you convince your leadership on this?
So first of all, congrats for being a one-person business development team. Fortunately, being a one-woman business development team is probably the same as being 5 men. So there we are. I don't know, is the answer. Chuck away at it. Tony, and I'm not sure if you have any more evolved answer. I can't imagine the pressure that people that this lady is in even being here. Congrats. I'm not sure I would have the scope. I've got a massive amount of respect immediately. There is this nagging notion that I think we have to remind ourselves that working ourselves into the grave, riding the old bicycle is not going to save us. Tony, and you've presented the funding gap. It's massive. So what's the alternative here? We know where the money is. We know it works in many circumstances. So what is the alternative here? I would only say that, and we said this in a video that's on the website recently, so please do check it out on the Amsterdam website. No amount of sheer limitless personal dedication and energy is going to get us to innovate. We're going to have to take a break and force the mental space at some point to say, let's lean back for 2-3 days, or for even just half a day, and think about the hard work of what we're doing here. I was in an organization 3-4 years ago where a strategy assignment revealed that their very good business development plan had no hope of reaching more than a very small percentage of people who suffer from this problem. So it was always like, so say, again, type of confidentiality, but basically we projected it saying, even if you're successful with your extremely ambitious business development plan, you're only serving less than 5% of beneficiaries. or people who need your services. What's the point? If we can't make a scaled impact in this hot and crowded world that is only going to get ever more climate shocks in the poly crisis, then we need to change gear somehow. Now, again, I want to highlight, Lewis, there are areas, particularly in the last mile services, which will always depend on, and that's for good reasons, on grants. So we do not want to innovate for innovation's sake.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. We also have a couple of questions here. Again, that are kind of similar around converting your value offer into an investable proposition. So a question around, what processes could be followed to work out how to identify how to convert your value offer into an investable proposition. Maybe questions you can ask yourself. And another one is a mental health NGO, and working with some of the poorest, most marginalized people of post-conflict communities in sub-Saharan Africa, and with little or no government investment in mental health. So they are a service provider rather than generating a product to invest in, and very small. So again, how could the model work for them? So how do you translate that to your organization?
So last question first, because that's the freshest in my mind. We worked with a disability organization the other day. I'm not saying that people who suffer mental challenges are always disabled, but here we had a subset of person who are having a health issue, and once they were slightly better, they wanted to heal. They wanted to continue providing services, as you put it, by putting them into the workspace. So they've worked with impact investors to design a workspace specifically for people suffering of people living with disabilities. Maybe we're thinking outside the box. This could work for people who have mental health challenges as well. Can we work with local employers on that side? I'm thinking outside the box here. Here's an opportunity. Here, an investor who then invests into those companies anyway would be motivated by saying, you know what, I'm increasing my investment also slightly to change the workplace or to allow job sharing or whatever is required to do in order to make that investment happening. You would almost certainly get donor funding for that. If you had an investor on board and a business who plays ball, I can find you a donor for that, who says, I'll take, you know what, okay, it's in a country which has difficult investment regimes, we will take the transaction costs. Because that is a great market-based solution here. That's a great amplifying factor for the donor. And I forgot the first question, sorry.
First question, bear with me, that was on sort of just processes you could follow to work out how to identify to converting your offer into an investable proposition. So maybe questions you could ask yourself about your value offer to sort of get there.
So one of the key questions is the one question we've shown, saying, can your mission be achieved in any other ways than grants? And here it's really important to not just be confined to your organization. I'm talking about your mission, not your organization. Your organization may be built for grant attraction and implementation, but can you do what you do with a different sort of funding? So educate ourselves. The other one is that giveaway. If some of what you do is generating or can generate revenue, even though it's not cost covering, then the answer is probably, yeah, there's something here. So, if you are investing in livelihoods into as the bakeries I've mentioned, for example, they work with, sex workers who didn't have any other employment options, so they've invested into a bakery chain, and that worked really, really well. There's a myriad of examples from offender rehabilitation, for example, works well with impact bonds, performance-based bonds. Here's an idea that can happen. So if any part of it is revenue active, I would say, not even breaking even, then the answer is likely yes. And then the third one is probably to what Kate said. Is your leadership even open to having a conversation? If the answer is yes, then the possibilities of generating a investable pitch is high. The other part, we have to not to go down the rabbit hole of investments, and don't regard investments as automatically something that needs to make money in 3-4 years. That is not that is the spectrum that I've shown. This is not the case. The other one is insurance. bear in mind, I've talked about guarantees here. Instead of, we have an organization at the moment in Latin America, and they have made a conglomerate of farmers, a cooperative of farmers, insurable. So they just been able to convince this insurer to say, can you set up a policy to invest certain defaults by these farmers? And then they used catalytic finance through a donor to say, can you cover a part of the premium, of the insurance premium? So that is, nothing was implemented on the field, but these farmers now can continue sending their kids to school even if the harvest fails, because they have this insurance policy behind it. And I've met some of these families. If you continue sending your child to school and your livelihood isn't threatened, whether the rain falls or not, that makes a big difference in people's life.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm pretty sure we're getting close to time, but there's some more questions, so we'll just try and squeeze them in as many as we can.
You know what? We can also, if we got the names, and there's I can see there's a ton of questions.
Yeah.
We can also, Louis, if you email us the questions, we can also try to get back to you by email.
Yes, absolutely. And anyone, if we don't get your question, you can also email us at events.bond.org.uk, and we'll connect you with Chris and Tony Ann. So if we don't get to you today, there is an opportunity to still speak with MZN.
And we can also,
email up.
Our email address is showing.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris.
Up here. There we go.
Wonderful. Well, I think what we'll do is, I know, Emma, you've had your hand up for a while, be waiting patiently there. So if would you like to ask your question, if you're available, feel free to unmute or let us know if it's been answered already.
Sorry.
Oops. Sorry, it's me. I muted you again.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi. I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Chris and Tony Ann. That was massively interesting. I've been in charity finance for nearly a decade now, and I'm a chair of a small charity in the northwest of England, but work in like the international development space. And actually, I wanted to feed back to Kate really quickly, just on some positive stuff that I've experienced in kind of her situation, if that's okay. Is that the one thing someone pointed out to me, someone who's been in like a very large national, international charity for like 2 decades, was that actually grants often come from, like, people perceive funders as kind of morally corrupt, like you were saying, like bad guys. And sometimes grants come from bad guys. So like, I know like a lot of UK prize, for instance, are funded by people like Barclays who don't have the best ethical record. So I think we need to recontextualize the money in terms of like, what's the good we can do with it and what's the best we can do, regardless. We want to make sure those funders come from backgrounds that we agree with and as close as we can, but we're not always going to do that. It's better to have bad money in good pockets, in my opinion, and doing good with it. So yeah, but I just really want to say thank you as well. It's so interesting to kind of see people moving away from a grant space.
Emma,
it's been such a scary thing for decades. So yeah.
Emma, thank you so much for saying this. I would like to provide some comfort to those who are nervous here. The kind of investor that you would call scary and exploitive, you probably not end up speaking to anyway.
No.
There are a huge spectrum, and what is really encouraging me personally is with my colleague as well at Human Planet is we noticed in the family offices. These are basically people who offices who manage the private funds of private people. Imagine being so rich you need an office for that. That's ridiculous, but it does exist. And we notice a generational change right now. There are people who are in their sort of 35 to 45, and they are not happy to manage the family legacy in exploitive industries anymore. We have a real generational challenge there right now. We have there are those meetings, particularly around Switzerland and south of Germany. We have them more and more and more, where people approach us. And ironically, to issue a frustration on my side, Louis, I know we're running up to time. They come to us and say, look, we want to deploy this money. We need this business because our family works in this area. So we have to work in these areas, but we are sick and tired of the people we work with for 50 years not getting any richer. How can we solve this? And those are encouraging, I think, voices. Obviously, the management challenge to NGOs and the investors, let's not forget them, is huge, because we have to bring two sometimes diametrically opposite worlds together.
Yeah, that's kind of the reassurance I wanted to give as well. So yeah, thanks so much for your time today.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tony Ann. I think that brings us to the end. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all the questions. It's just it's obviously a hot topic. There's plenty to say. So please do follow up with us and follow up with Chris and Tony Ann, and we'll connect you. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. We'll say goodbye and see you soon at the next event.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks to
Bye.
Bond for hosting this.